And this is, I think, where the nerd in me has never left. I like nerds. I think I'm happy, proud to be a nerd, particularly about old magazines. I've always loved them from when I was a child. And then when I was writing, as a hobby, hoping to find something that really clicked, I tried to do a contemporary romance, and it was a good piece of learning. Didn't have a plot, but it was a good piece of learning. And so I was looking for something to write about, and I found on eBay a 1939 copy of a women's weekly magazine, and that was it. It was an immediate light bulb moment of absolute luck, because here was this magazine that I was so familiar with, because it had all the things we still have in beauty and fashion and cooking, and of course a problem page, the advice column, but it was another era. It was like another world, but a very familiar one. And as soon as I read the problem page, I thought that this is what I want to write about, because every advice column has 5 or 6 mini novels in itself. And so I started collecting magazines, not all from the war to start with. And then I sort of realized that was my main area of interest. And I think now I have about 800, 900 magazines, not quite 1,000, but a huge library of them. So they're invaluable, because I go back to those and immerse myself in them, and all the problems in the books are from them. They're all rewritten, of course, but all the serious problems, the emotional problems that the readers write in about to my heroine, they're all problems women had, and I know they did. Sort of. I mean, Henrietta is actually my great-grandmother. Her maiden name was Henrietta Bird, and which I found hilarious as a child, because Henriette a bird, what a brilliant name. We used to say, what if she'd married a man called Mr. Sandwich? Then she'd have been Henrietta Sandwich, and which we found hilarious for our entire childhoods. But she was a complete matriarch in our family, and tough as old boots. She was a cook housekeeper by trade, and pretty pushy, sort of ran the place with a rod of iron. And so she has always been around in my background, but she was put together with the advice columnists I read in older magazines from the 1890s and the 1900s, who were absolute dragons. I mean, they were really tough, and people, I mean, the problems were very, very different in the 1890s, whereas by the 1940s, women were in the war, were writing into a magazine saying, I've fallen in love with a chap who isn't my husband, or I'm pregnant and not married, you know, problems that we can relate to, or my husband's being very unpleasant to me. The problems back in the 1890s, 1900s were, there's a chap in the village that I rather like. Might I say hello to him, or should I wait until my father introduces me? And so very, very different. And the advice columnists then their advice was very to the point. And for people who wrote in one particular magazine, people wrote in with their poems and their stories, hoping to be published, which of course I relate to. And the responses are just awful. I mean, it's sort of the only thing good about your poem is it's short. It's, you know, and I see no clear talent in your writing, so I shouldn't bother. And absolutely crushing. And so that's where the Dear Mrs. Bird book came from. I thought, what if we brought a young, optimistic, dynamic woman in 1940 and put her together with an advice columnist who had that old-fashioned, rather tough view of things, and see how they get on together. Well, Emmy was, I knew I wanted someone young and sort of quite gung-ho about things, but I also had to really think her through, because obviously writing historical fiction, you have to be really careful about not making them too modern and not planting our views and our experiences from the 21st century back in 1940. So I thought, okay, I want someone who will stand up for other women, who will feel passionately about friendship and about looking after each other, and not be a goody-goody. I didn't want a do-gooder. but I wanted someone who would have passion about writing for women and helping them. And so I'd been reading about Emmeline Pankhurst, which is where Emmy's name obviously comes from. And I got to thinking, well, what about the daughters of the women in the women's suffrage movement? You wouldn't, it's very easy to look back and go, well, there were the suffragettes, and then it was flappers, and then it was the Great Depression and the war, and then the 50s, Stepford Wives, 60s, Woodstock, woo, here we are. It's very easy to make these huge generalizations, but I thought if your mum and your granny had been politically very involved in the 1900s, and you would have some of that. If you've been brought up by that sort of woman, you would expect that you would be heard, even though back then you weren't as heard as now, of course. So I thought that's where she'll come from. She'll have quite a political side to the family. And then I gave her dad is a GP, he's a family doctor. So she has a very loved, very middle-class background, which gives her the confidence to stand up and say, this isn't right. So when you put the kind of more bohemian political together with the confident and strong, that's where Emmy sort of grew from. She has beliefs and morals and convictions, and also a rather klutzy sort of, well, if I just try hard enough, things will be fine, which of course isn't exactly right. So she has to grow up, as everyone had to, very quickly during the war. But that's where she comes from. Emmy joins Women's Friend by mistake, really, because she thinks she's going to an interview. She is going to an interview at the publishers, but it's not for their newspaper. It is for this kind of poor relation that they have, which is the women's magazine. And she's so thrilled to be anywhere near a publishing house. And I know how she feels about that. You know, you go, the first time you go and meet anyone to talk about your books, you're just like, oh my word, this is it. I'm speaking to a proper editor. La 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 la, nothing. And so yes, Emmy starts writing back to the women, not in her own name, but she thinks it makes sense. They've written to Henrietta Bird, who's the advice columnist. So if I just pretend to be her, she'll never know, no harm done. And it's fine until she does find out, of course. And the backdrop to all of this is it's in the middle of the Blitz. So it's an extraordinary time for everybody. I felt she was having sort of really decided who she was, and particularly when I introduced her best friends called Bunty, and that's when she came super alive, really. That the book opens with her finding an advert for a job that she thinks is going to be for a newspaper, and she rushes home to her best friend and says, look, this is the job I've dreamt of to break into journalism. And Bunty, as all good friends do, immediately says, this is brilliant. This is the job for you. You're going to be amazing. This unconditional belief that best friends have. And from there, I thought they together, because I love writing about friendship, together they feel invincible. You know, it's kind of, we can do this. We got through our childhood, and we're in London, and I believe in you, you believe in me, let's do it. So for Emmy, she thinks that this is the right thing to do, that when Mrs. Bird won't help people or with problems that she says are unpleasantnesses, that is relationships and sex and all that sort of stuff, Emmy is fueled by her belief and her friends' belief, and kind of stupidly actually starts secretly helping the women. I mean, one of my first jobs out of university was working in the marketing department at a magazine publishers. And the editors and the editorial directors, we were all in awe of. They were absolute gods. So I know that no one in their right minds would pretend to be an editor. It's insane. But that's what makes her an interesting character. The letters are all based on real letters. So I have read, I suppose, probably several thousand letters that were printed by women's magazines during the time, and I log them. And if I'm reading one and I say, oh, now that's an interesting one, and so I'll tab it and say that here's an interesting one. And so I have a bank of issues and ideas, and some become major plot lines, and others become a letter from someone that Emmy will help, and others might turn into a more comic kind of part. There are some basic sort of bricks to put in, I think, when it's a new book. And I was looking for a new baddie, and the bad guys in the second book are men, and I thought I want a female antagonist, but she can't be the same as Mrs. Bird in the first book. I want something new and fresh, so I'll make her younger. And I'm always trying to raise the stakes. I think that's another thing that, of course, we all have to do. Let's make the stakes higher. And so this time it's not just an editor coming in or a new publisher. This is a new owner of the whole magazine. So the stakes couldn't be much higher on that front. And with Mrs. Porter Calling, Emmy is now, she's growing up well. She's really done her homework. She's an excellent advice columnist. The magazine's doing really well. Everything's going very well. At home, things are fun. They're all worried about the men who are away, but they're cracking on with things. And so Cressida Porter, the Honourable Cressida Porter, I wanted someone who was completely different to Emmy, and she's her late 30s. She's beautiful. She's described at the start as, it's like being hit in the face with a powder puff the size of a dustbin lid. It's kind of, is it lovely or is it kind of appalling? Nobody knows, but she's charming, and she's very posh. She's very privileged. She's totally entitled. And she lulls everybody into thinking she's going to be terrific. And then, of course, she tries to change everything. And I wanted I wanted someone in the books who hadn't stepped up, who didn't do their bit, because again, not everyone did. You know, we talk about our greatest generation, and so many people did incredible things, but there were lazy people and people who took advantage, you know, people who profiteered. The black market was huge in terms of illegal trading. Crime was high. You know, there were some bad people. And so I thought, well, what if you weren't one of the ones who steps up and tries hard? What if you were still lazy and selfish? Because that's going to drive Emmy mad. And so, yeah, she's a formidable opponent because she has the power of owning the magazine, and she's a bit of a monster. She was a joy to write. She was great fun. But she is, the serious part as ever is that here is a spoilt brat of a woman who wants to change a magazine into her own personal society magazine, when in actual fact, and again, it goes back to the reality at the time, the women's magazines were playing such an important role, you know, in terms of morale, not just practical tips, but in terms of emotional support and morale. They were really important, and the Ministry of Information worked very closely with the magazines, because they were the way that they could get information out to women and keep the women of Britain going. So to have a selfish posho come in and try and change that was something that I knew would mean a huge fight, and it does. So I have this bank of various letters that I refer to, and some I perhaps read 5 or 6 years ago, but they haven't fitted in properly. They all have their time. And so, for example, in this one, there are more letters from mothers than perhaps there were before, because one of the parts of Mrs. Porter Calling is there are children in the book, and it's about finding your family, really. It's all the grown-ups coming together around to help each other and to try and help. It's Thelma, who is Emmy's friend. It's her kids come to stay with her, and Thelma and all the others are trying to make their lives as normal as you can make kids' lives in the war. So I was able to sort of show Emmy's connection to not only the children she loves in real life, but her understanding of her readers' children and what they mean to them, and how much they'll try to protect them in circumstances that you often can't. So that's great to have those. And then I can I have to come up with their names, and for just those little periods of time in the middle of a book about somebody else, I get to sort of come out of it and go, okay, where do they live? Because then they're always sort of, this letter is from Deirdre in Birmingham or whatever. So I'm sort of, now where would they live? No, that's too country, that's too urban. Let's do someone from Scotland. And then they have little tiny lives that are never on the page really, but they're like little bubbles that I get to have in the middle of the long-term character commitments that I have. So these are real problems by real people, and there's a responsibility to try to do the right thing by them, because whenever I speak to women, and it is mostly women who are kind enough to share their memories of the war era, these are real people and real lives and loves and loss, and I don't want to muck around with that. I want to look after that properly, because people share some serious stuff, and went through horrific times. So I always try to I hope treat it properly, and do my best to represent as far as I can the people that I've spoken to. So it's fun, and it's, you kind of get over, you have to feel quite passionate, I think, about what you write anyway. And when you're being influenced by people you've met, or readers are amazing as well. I've just been out on tour over here, because the Mrs. Porter Calling came out a month or so ago. And after I've done talks and events, readers are amazing. They come and they share their memories of when they were little, or what their mum did. And I quite often will say, oh, can I use that? And oh, I'd love to use that, and scurry away and write it down. And it's kind of special to get to do that, I think.